He laughed when he said it, a riddle no one in the world could solve, worth $800 million. Engineers, scientists, and programmers all failed until a quiet maid, sweeping the floors at night, left behind an answer that changed everything. What she revealed didn't just shock a CEO, it redefined what true genius really means. The skyline of Tokyo shimmered like liquid glass under the fading sun, each tower glowing with silent authority. At the very top of the tallest one stood Tanaka Innovations, a place where the brightest minds in artificial intelligence gathered under one name, Hiro Tanaka. People called him the Digital Emperor of Asia. His company had built systems that powered governments, predicted markets, and mapped human behavior. But Hiro wasn't just known for his brilliance. He was known for his arrogance. That morning, the company's grand auditorium buzzed with tension. Engineers, scientists, and analysts filled every seat, whispering in excitement as Hiro walked onto the stage, his sharp black suit reflecting the silver lights. He stood tall, confident, his hands folded behind his back as if addressing a kingdom. Without a word, he tapped the glowing board beside him. A complex equation spread across the air, twisting lines, shifting symbols, and an encrypted code that seemed alive. The murmurs stopped instantly. "This," Hiro began, his voice calm but commanding, "is the Tanaka riddle. It represents a breakthrough system our AI has failed to decode. Whoever solves this will earn an $800 million partnership, and my personal respect." A stunned silence filled the room, followed by nervous laughter. A few engineers exchanged doubtful looks while others whispered, "He's joking, right?" Hiro smiled slightly, the kind of smile that mocked anyone who thought they could reach his level. "If you find it impossible," he said, "perhaps you were never meant to understand genius." The audience chuckled uneasily, but no one dared speak back. At the far end of the hall, unnoticed by anyone, a woman pushed her cleaning cart quietly along the wall. Her name was Grace Walker. She wore a plain gray uniform and carried herself with quiet grace, eyes that saw everything but spoke nothing. She wasn't supposed to be there during meetings, but she'd been told to finish early that day, so she stayed in the shadows, listening. As Hiro continued explaining the rules of his riddle, Grace found herself drawn to the way the numbers seemed to dance in patterns that weren't entirely mathematical. To her, it didn't look like code. It looked like a question about people, about choice and emotion disguised as logic. When the meeting ended, the employees filed out, chattering about bonuses, promotions, and how ridiculous the challenge was. $800 million for a riddle? "He's lost it," one man muttered. "It's impossible. Even our AI failed." "That's the point," another replied, laughing. "He just wants to prove we're beneath him." By evening, the building grew quiet. The lights dimmed to a soft glow, reflecting against the spotless marble floors. Grace was still there, sweeping near the front of the stage. Her eyes lifted again to the massive holographic puzzle still flickering in the air, symbols shifting like waves. She remembered Hiro's words. Not everyone deserves to understand genius. Something about that line stayed with her. She had heard that tone before, from professors who once told her that brilliance had a color, an accent, a name that didn't sound like hers. She had been a computer science student once, before her mother's illness forced her to drop out. Since then, she had worked quietly, cleaning offices, fixing things others ignored, but her mind never stopped solving problems. She stepped closer to the glowing symbols. Her reflection merged with the light, her eyes following the shifting lines. At first glance, it looked like chaos, but when she looked longer, she noticed something. Every third symbol repeated a pattern like a heartbeat. The riddle wasn't about computation. It was about rhythm, empathy, and the unpredictability of human behavior. She whispered to herself, "It's not about solving numbers. It's about understanding people." She pulled out a small notebook from her apron pocket, a habit she'd kept from her student days, and began scribbling thoughts. Hours passed unnoticed as she studied the light, connecting each symbol to a human trait: trust, greed, fear, love. She realized the riddle was built to measure the limits of logic, something no AI could ever fully capture. It wasn't an algorithmic failure. It was a moral one. The building was silent except for the distant hum of machines. Midnight had come and gone. Grace's eyes were tired, but her mind was alive. With a deep breath, she wrote down a single sentence. An answer so simple it almost felt wrong. She read it again, smiled faintly, and tore the paper from her notebook. Walking into Hiro Tanaka's office, she hesitated at the door. The walls were filled with awards, trophies, and photographs of him shaking hands with world leaders. On his desk lay stacks of files, his name engraved in gold. For a moment, Grace wondered if she was out of her mind. A maid leaving an answer for one of the world's most powerful men. But then she remembered the board, the pattern, the message hidden behind pride. She placed the note neatly in the center of his desk. It contained just a few lines. Not equations, not formulas, but a perspective no machine could understand. Then she turned off the lights, took her cart, and left quietly down the empty hallway. As the doors closed behind her, the faint glow of the puzzle still flickered in the boardroom, unsolved to everyone else, but now carrying the imprint of one unseen mind that refused to believe genius belonged only to the powerful. Morning light spilled through the glass walls of Tanaka Innovations, washing the chrome floors in gold. The city outside was already alive, but inside the building felt unusually still. Hiro Tanaka arrived earlier than usual, followed by his top executives and engineers, all eager to begin another day chasing perfection. He walked straight toward his office, his sharp eyes scanning the room the way a general scans a battlefield. But as he placed his briefcase on the table, his gaze froze. There, in the center of his immaculate black desk, lay a single piece of paper. It was folded neatly, written in clean, graceful handwriting. No signature, no title, just a few carefully chosen words. Hiro frowned, picking it up. He recognized immediately that the symbols on the paper referenced his riddle, but not in the way he had expected. The note didn't contain any long equations or technical jargon. It was simple, elegant, and strangely human. He stared for a moment before calling his head engineer, Michael Torres. "Did one of you leave this here?" he asked sharply. Michael walked over, took one glance, and shook his head. "No, sir. None of us worked overnight." Hiro's eyes narrowed. Then who did? They all gathered around the desk, curiosity turning into confusion. Hiro, impatient, waved toward the nearby screen. "Run it. Let's see what happens." Michael hesitated, then entered the short sequence written on the note into the system. The massive holographic board flickered to life, lines of code scrolling faster and faster as if awakening from a long sleep. The engineers leaned forward, whispering to one another. Within seconds, the impossible happened. The board stopped moving, the equation stabilized, and a single green word appeared in the center of the air. Solved. A heavy silence fell over the room. For a full 10 seconds, no one breathed. Then one of the analysts muttered, almost in awe, That's not possible." Another whispered, "Our AI failed this riddle for weeks." "How?" Hiro's face hardened. He didn't smile. He didn't even blink. His jaw tightened as he stared at the glowing solution. For a man who prided himself on control, the sight of someone solving his masterpiece so effortlessly felt like a personal wound. "Who?" he demanded. "Put this here." The staff exchanged nervous looks. Then Lena Brooks, the HR director, spoke softly. "Sir, the night staff cleaned your office. The note must have been left after hours." Hiro turned slowly toward her, his expression unreadable. "The night staff?" His tone dripped with disbelief. "You're suggesting a janitor solved a riddle that our global team couldn't?" No one dared to answer. Hiro exhaled sharply and leaned against the desk, trying to laugh it off. "A maid, don't waste my time. Someone's playing a prank." But when he looked again at the handwriting, the steady lines, the clarity, the lack of fear, he felt a strange unease. There was no sign of mockery in those words, only quiet confidence. "Bring her here," he ordered finally. Minutes later, Grace Walker stepped into the boardroom, still wearing her gray uniform, her gloves neatly folded in one hand. The same room where no one had noticed her before was now filled with stares, curious, skeptical, even mocking. She stood near the door, humble but calm. Hero looked at her like a man who couldn't decide whether to laugh or be offended. "So," he said, "you're the one who left this note on my desk?" Grace nodded once. "Yes, sir." Hero's lips curled into a smirk. "Do you even understand what this represents?" Grace didn't flinch. "I think so," she said quietly. "It wasn't about the math. It was about behavior, how decisions change depending on emotion. You built it like a logical maze, but the pattern depended on empathy, not code." The engineers frowned, glancing at one another. Hero crossed his arms, amused but intrigued. "Empathy?" he repeated. "This is a mathematical riddle. Machines don't feel empathy." Grace stepped closer to the holographic board, her voice steady but respectful. "Exactly. That's why they couldn't solve it. The symbols weren't numbers. They were choices. Each variable was a human reaction disguised as data. When I replaced logic with emotion in the final sequence, the system balanced itself." She pointed to the holographic display. "See here, you used the variable E repeatedly. Everyone assumed it stood for energy, but it actually represented expectation. In emotional logic, expectation drives imbalance. The system failed because it tried to remove emotion instead of accounting for it. When I reversed that, the equation found equilibrium." The room was dead silent. Michael, the head engineer, stepped closer, following her explanation. As she walked through each segment, connecting symbols to human behaviors, trust, fear, hope, regret, it became impossible not to understand. The puzzle that had mocked even the world's best engineers now made perfect sense through the eyes of a maid who saw people instead of numbers. When she finished, Grace turned to face them. "Your riddle wasn't missing data," she said softly. "It was missing understanding." No one moved. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the projector. Hiro Tanaka, the man who had humiliated hundreds for their failures, stood completely still. His arrogance cracked just slightly as he looked at her. A woman without degrees, without position, standing where none of his top minds ever dared to stand. His throat tightened as he searched for something to say, but nothing came. For the first time in his career, Hiro Tanaka was speechless. The building buzzed with whispers long after the meeting ended. It was as if electricity ran through every corridor of Tanaka Innovations. The story spread like wildfire, how the company's impossible riddle had been solved by the woman who scrubbed its floors. Some called it luck, others called it a miracle. A few were cruel enough to laugh and say it must have been an accident. But most of all, people were talking about the maid who saw what no one else could. Grace heard the murmurs wherever she went. Engineers glanced at her as she passed, pretending not to stare. Some smiled politely. Others whispered behind their hands. She didn't react. She kept her head down, her work steady, her mind calm. The world had noticed her for one day, but she didn't want fame. She only wanted peace. That afternoon, as she cleaned the upper hallway, Lena Brooks approached her. Lena had been the only executive who looked at Grace with something more than curiosity. There was kindness in her eyes. She waited quietly until Grace finished polishing the glass railing before speaking. "You never told anyone you were educated," Lena said softly. "Why?" Grace paused, lowering the cloth in her hand. "Because no one ever asked," she said with a faint smile. Lena frowned. "Still, to solve something like that, you must have studied this before." Grace nodded slightly. "I studied computer science at Columbia." Her voice carried no pride, only a distant warmth, like remembering a different life. "It was everything I ever wanted. But my mother got sick halfway through my second year. Medical bills. They never stop. I tried to keep up, but life doesn't slow down for anyone. I left school to work. Then I just kept working." Lena's chest tightened. "And you ended up here?" Grace gave a small shrug. "Work is work. I needed something stable. This job pays on time and it's quiet. I can think." She smiled faintly as she wiped the last streak from the glass. "I still love learning. I read manuals, code on old laptops, watch lectures on my phone when the Wi-Fi's good. I guess I never stopped being a student." Lena stood silent for a moment, her heart heavy with respect. But neither of them realized that Hiro Tanaka had been standing at the end of the hallway just around the corner. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, at least not at first. He'd come looking for her, uncertain of what to say, but now he found himself frozen by her words. He listened to the quiet honesty in her tone and felt a sharp sting of shame in his chest. For years, he'd built walls of pride so high that he believed genius lived only in offices with polished titles. He thought brilliance had a uniform, a degree, a certain tone of voice. But hearing Grace speak, so calm and unbitter, made him realize how blind he'd been. That evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Hiro walked down the maintenance corridor for the first time in his life. It was colder there, the floors marked with the dull shine of mop water, the walls humming softly with the sound of air vents. He found Grace in the janitor's room, refilling her cleaning cart. She looked surprised when he appeared at the doorway. He stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. "Grace," he said finally, his tone quieter than usual. "I owe you an apology." She straightened up, wiping her hands on her uniform. "There's no need, sir." "There is," he insisted. "I built a test to challenge the world. I wanted to prove that my mind was beyond reach, and you solved it while cleaning my floor." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Do you have any idea what that did to my pride?" Grace looked at him evenly, her expression kind but firm. "Pride is only hurt when it's too heavy to carry," she said softly. "You don't have to be sorry. You created something extraordinary. I just looked at it differently." Hiro studied her face, trying to understand how someone so humble could hold so much quiet strength. After a long pause, he asked the question that had haunted him since morning. "Why did you do it? You could have embarrassed me. You could have told everyone." Grace smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I just wanted to solve what everyone said couldn't be solved." She looked down at her hands, her voice steady but gentle. "Sometimes we don't do things to prove we're smart. We do them to remember we still can." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Hiro felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked away for years behind ambition and ego. For the first time he saw her not as a maid, not as a mystery, but as a mirror, a reflection of what he'd lost in his chase for perfection. Curiosity, humility, humanity. He nodded slowly. "You've done more than solve a riddle, Grace," he said quietly. "You've solved me." She gave him a small, kind smile. "Then I'd say we both did our jobs today." Hiro didn't laugh. He only bowed his head in respect before turning to leave the small janitor's room, the weight of his own lesson following him down the long, silent hallway. The morning sun spilled through the tall glass walls of Tanaka Innovations, casting golden light over the gathered employees. The company had never seen such a crowd. Every engineer, every assistant, every executive was there, whispering about the announcement Hiro Tanaka had called. The man was not known for meetings like this, not without a reason. Grace stood quietly at the back, her cleaning cart tucked beside her. She wore her uniform as always, simple and neat, blending into the edges of the crowd, yet somehow every gaze seemed drawn toward her. When Hiro walked onto the stage, the entire room fell silent. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the audience that had once shared his arrogance. He wasn't wearing his usual cold expression. His shoulders looked less stiff, his voice softer as he finally spoke. "I've spent my life believing genius came with titles, wealth, and privilege," he began. "That it lived only in those who sat in these chairs." His eyes swept across the rows of executives. "But yesterday, someone reminded me that true brilliance has nothing to do with position or status. It's about perspective, the courage to see what others overlook." The crowd exchanged puzzled looks, unsure where this was going. Then Hiro turned toward the back of the room. "Grace," he said, his voice echoing, "would you please come to the stage?" A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. The maid, the same woman who polished their floors? Grace froze, unsure if she had heard him right. Lena, standing nearby, gently touched her shoulder. "Go," she whispered with a proud smile. Grace hesitated for a moment, then began walking forward, every step heavy with disbelief. People moved aside, their whispers growing softer. When she reached the stage, Hero gestured for her to stand beside him. The difference between them, the powerful CEO and the quiet Maid, was so striking that the audience held its breath. Hero turned to face everyone and said clearly, "This woman solved the unsolvable. While we were busy proving how intelligent we were, she reminded us what intelligence truly means." The hall erupted in astonished silence. Hero continued, his voice trembling with sincerity. "I owe her an apology, not just for doubting her, but for creating a world where someone like her had to hide her mind behind a mop." His words hit the room like a soft earthquake, subtle but powerful enough to shake hearts. Then, he did something no one expected. He reached into his jacket and took out a folder. "Grace," he said, "I made a promise. Whoever solved that riddle would earn $800 million in stock and profit share." Gasps broke through the audience. Hero turned to her with deep respect. "You earned this." Grace looked at the papers in disbelief. The room was watching, waiting for her to cry, to celebrate, to take what was rightfully hers. But instead, she stepped back and shook her head gently. "Sir," she said softly, her voice steady and kind, "I didn't do it for money." Hero frowned slightly. "Then why?" Grace took a deep breath, her eyes glistening. "Because I wanted to prove that dreams don't die when life gets hard. They just change shape." Her gaze moved across the audience, the interns, the janitors, the executives. "If you really want to honor this, don't give me money. Use it to help girls like me, girls who dream big but never get the chance to study, to create, to be seen." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, people began to clap. One by one, hands came together until the entire hall filled with thunderous applause. Some of the engineers wiped their eyes. Even Lena had tears streaming down her cheeks. Grace stood still, overwhelmed, her heart beating faster with every cheer. Hero didn't hide his emotion either. He looked at her with something that had been missing in his life for years: humility. When the noise settled, he leaned toward the microphone and said quietly, "You've solved something far greater than a riddle. Grace, you solved my pride." Grace smiled faintly, her eyes shining under the bright lights. She bowed slightly, not in submission but in gratitude. "Then maybe we both learned something worth more than money," she replied. The applause started again, louder, rising through the glass walls like a wave that refused to stop. Hero stepped aside as Grace slowly descended from the stage, walking back through the same aisle she had once cleaned in silence. This time, no one looked through her. They looked at her, with admiration, with respect, with something close to awe. As she reached the exit, sunlight poured across the marble floor, painting her path in gold. She paused for a second, glancing back at the building she had once entered as invisible. Now, every hallway, every desk, every whisper carried her name. Grace, the maid who solved the unsolvable. Outside, the air felt lighter. She looked up at the skyline of Tokyo, where the city buzzed with life, and smiled. Somewhere behind her, Hero's voice carried through the loudspeakers, announcing a new scholarship fund in her name, the Grace Initiative, for women in science and technology. As the doors closed behind her, Grace walked away quietly, carrying nothing but the satisfaction of knowing she had changed something far bigger than one man's pride. She had changed a legacy. Because sometimes the brightest minds don't shine from the top of towers. They shine from the quiet corners where no one is looking, until one act of courage turns their silence into history.